Okay, so I have an exercise for you, and this is the type of output that we'll get. This is to test your knowledge on dynamic two-dimensional arrays. In the output I get enter the number of rows and columns. So I'll do 2 and 3 maybe. Press enter. Now for debugging purposes, I'm using the entity again. In other words, the arrays on the heap will actually be arrays of entities. Then I can enter 3 numbers for the row, number 0. Because for that row, of course, we have 3 columns. I entered 2 rows, 3 columns. So for every row, we have 3 columns. I'll enter some values here, 2, 4, and 6, for example, for the first row. And maybe 1, 3, and 5 for the second row. Press enter, and then I get this sort of printout. I get the table. So a table format printout. I just have this table here, this separator, and then I have the actual printouts here. So the member in that entity is going to be 2, and so on. So we get those values printed out. And we can see those correspond to what we entered for those rows. And then we also get the destructors invoked. Again, this is just for debugging purposes to make sure that our objects on the heap actually get deallocated properly. And we can see that those correspond to what we entered, so those get deallocated properly. And we get end of program. Okay, so in the main function, I will show you what I did on a high level, so just a few hints for you. You can see in the main function, not all of the code is in the main function, and that's the goal with this exercise, is to break things out into functions. So I have rows and columns, enter the number of rows and columns, and I do C in rows and columns. Then I have a pointer to an entity, pointer to pointer table, and you can see I actually use a entity array factory function, and I pass in rows and columns, and that will return a pointer to the dynamic array of pointers on the heap. So that is basically the function that is going to construct all of the arrays on the heap. Then we go and initialize that, and this is basically where we do the input from the keyboard to actually enter values for each member. Then I go and print those out, all of the values in the table, and then I want to make sure to deallocate all of the arrays on the heap. Now you may want to try this with a fundamental type such as an integer, for example, and then maybe do it with our typical generalized entity class, just so you can sort of see the difference. And then of course to actually make sure you get the destructors invoked as you would expect. Again, your output and your function names do not have to be the same as my ones. So here you can have fill, for example, instead of initialize, or output instead of print, or whatever you want to do. And your printouts don't have to look like mine. Go ahead, give this a try, and when I come back I'll show my implementation. Okay, so I'm using the entity class again for this example, so we can again see the outputs here, entity destruct, invoked, and so on. You may have to modify the toString member function to work with this. I just have a tab in here, but again, that is based on how I want my output to be. Okay, then I have the entity array factory, which is going to return a pointer to an entity. It takes in the amount of rows and columns, and this is where I actually allocate the array of pointers to entities on the heap. And I store that in a temporary pointer to pointer right here, which is what I'm going to return down here as well. And of course, in the for loop, we actually go and allocate the arrays of entities on the heap as well. Okay, so I've explained this before. We assign those addresses of the first elements within those arrays to the elements in the array of pointers to entities. Then next we have the initialize function, which has these 3 formal parameters, a pointer, again, to entity, rows and columns. I have a temporary variable here just for the input, for the numbers. And for readability, I have int current row instead of I, and the same with column. Okay, I talked about this before. This again is just for readability. And I do this statement here, enter the amount of columns. This is how I get that output. Columns, numbers for row number, current row. Okay, and then I go and do a for loop. Current column is less than columns parameter. I do that temp. I just make sure to set that back to 0. You probably don't have to do this, but I do that just in case. And then I do the console input temp. And then since we are working with entities here, I do this p, which again is the formal parameter. Pass in the current row, the current column, dot set memo on that, and I pass in temp. Following all of this, every once in a while you may want to do a console output with an end line depending on what you want. It's almost done with these function definitions. We have the print function, Okay, we want to pass in the pointer to pointer, so we have a formal parameter, pointer to pointer to entity here, takes in the rows and columns as well, and this is where we of course are going to do the printout of the table. So I have nested for loops as before in the initialize function. And basically all we're going to do here is we're going to use the pointer to pointer p, and we're going to invoke toString on what that returns. Then we go in the allocate. As I've explained before, we also want to pass in the pointer to pointer, and we want to pass in the rows. So for every row we are going to deallocate the array that that pointer is going to point at. Then finally we want to deallocate the array that the pointer to pointer actually points to itself, which is going to be the array of pointers. Then in the main function, again I have just scroll up here, I have the rows and columns. I enter the number of rows and columns here from the keyboard, rows and columns. Again, this is what I want to demonstrate with dynamic two-dimensional arrays, is that we can allocate those during program execution, whereas with stack arrays, again, the size of those need to be known at compile time. Okay, so I create my pointer to pointer entity, which is going to be a table, and I use the entity array factory, pass in rows and columns to go and construct all of the arrays on the heap. Then I use the initialize function. Each time I just pass in the pointer to pointer table here. Eventually I print those out and I deallocate those. Build around that one more time. Maybe we'll do 3 rows with 5 columns each. Now we get these constructors invoked. Once you realize that the program works as expected, then maybe you can go and comment these out, but I just tend to keep them in here. So I'll enter 5 numbers for the row, the first row, and then 5 numbers for the second row, and 5 numbers for the third row as well. And then we get the printout, we get our table here. We can check that our rows match with the input that we had. Okay, we can check that easily right here. And then we can also check that our destructors were called. Okay, and those match with what we've entered. So I hope you found this exercise interesting. I hope it was not too difficult for you. Dynamic two-dimensional arrays can be a bit confusing for beginners, so that is why I spent a lot of time trying to explain it in detail for you, step by step. As I mentioned, we won't be using dynamic two-dimensional arrays all that much, but it does test our knowledge on heap allocation, arrays, pointers to pointers, and an understanding of this sort of information is important if we want to create our own data structures. Okay, that is going to wrap up this exercise. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you next time.